じゃあですね、今日のアドベントシリーズ入っていきたいと思います。
And yeah, just with that, then we'd like to get into our Advent series.
これからクリスマスの日までですね、クリスマス、イエス・キリストの誕生までの出来事を一緒に3週間見ていきたいと思いま
And
す。
so just in this series up until Christmas, we want to talk about all of the different events that took place leading up until Jesus' birth.
今日はマリア、そして来週はヨセフ、その後はザカリアのお話から皆さんと分かち合っていければと思っています。
And so this week we're going to talk about Mary, and then the week after this will be Joseph, and then the week after that will be Zechariah.
はい、じゃあ今日はですね、ルカ書の1章26節から38節、いつも通り日本語だけで読んでいきますので、英語の方は自分の聖書を開くか、スクリーンを見てほしいと思います。
And then today's passage will be the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verse 26 through 38. And as always, we're just going to be reading in Japanese, so if you're an English speaker, you can either follow along on the screen or in your own Bible.
はい、26節から、さて、その6ヶ月目に御使いガブリエルが神から使わされて、ガリラヤのナザレという町の一人の処女のところに来た。この処女はダビデの家系のヨセフという人の言い名付けで名をマリアと言った。御使いは入ってくるとマリアに言った。おめでとう、恵まれた方、主があなたと共におられます。しかしマリアはこの言葉にひどく戸惑って、これは一体何の挨拶かと考え込んだ。すると御使いは彼女に言った。恐れることはありません。マリア、あなたは神から恵みを受けたのです。見なさい、あなたは身ごもって男の子を産みます。その名をイエスとつけなさい。その子は大いなるものとなり、糸高き方の子と呼ばれます。また神である主は彼にその父ダビデの王位をお与えになります。彼は常しえにヤコブの家を治め、その支配には終わりがありません。マリアは御使いに言った。どうしてそのようなことが起こるのでしょう。私は男の人を知りませんのに。御使いは彼女に答えた。聖霊があなたの上に臨み、糸高き方の力があなたを覆います。それゆえ生まれる子は聖なるもの、神の子と呼ばれます。見なさい、あなたの親類のエリザベツ。あの人もあの年になって男の子を宿しています。不妊と言われいた人なのに、今はもう6ヶ月です。神にとって不可能なことはありません。マリアは言った。ご覧ください。私は主のはしためです。どうぞあなたのお言葉通りに好みになりますように。すると御使いは彼女から去っていった。このストーリー、ルカ書のストーリーが入っていますけれども、マリアという人物はある意味一番クリスチャンとしての人生を最初に体験した人でもあるというふうに呼ばれています。
So we're going into this series starting with the very first chapter of Luke, and we're talking about this girl, Mary, and we can actually kind of say that she was one of the first people, probably the first person who actually experienced like being a Christian.
事実、イエスというキリストという存在を自分の内に秘め、そして育てていった。妊娠して育てていって、要はそれの成長、キリストが自分の中でどうやってどんどん大きくなっていったのか。そういうことを身をもって体験した存在です。
So we talk about being a Christian is having Christ dwell within you. She literally had Christ living within her and growing more and more, like literally inside of her.
すなわちイエス・キリストという存在、イエス・キリストに出会い、そしてクリスチャンとして成長していくきっかけ、それはどういうものなのかというものを教えてくれているそのような聖書箇所だと思います。
And I think this is a passage that kind of shows like what is it actually like to actually encounter God and to actually have God show you like who is Jesus, what is Jesus going to be like, and how are you going to grow through that.
なので今日のメッセージではイエス・キリストに出会い、そしてクリスチャンとして歩んでいくこと、成長していくことということはどういうことなのかということを3つのポイントに分けて学んでいきたいと思います。
And so over 3 points today, we want to talk about what does this actually look like to have an encounter with God, to experience God revealing Himself to you, and then to grow through that.
最初のポイントは神様が介入してくる、私たちの人生に介入するということはどういうことなのか、それが1番目のポイント。
And the first point is the intervention of God, and when God just kind of comes into your life.
そして2番目、神様は人生の何を変えてくれるのか、どのような変化をもたらしてくれるのか。
And then the second point is how does God actually bring change into your life?
はい、そして、唯一私たちを変えてくれる存在ということを3番目のポイントでやっていきたいと思います。
And then the third point will be kind of the only one who can truly change us.
はい、28節、こう書いてあります。御使いは入ってくるとマリアに言った。おめでとう、恵まれた方、主があなたと共におられます。 言ってますね。
And this is how it says in verse 28 of the passage. It says, and he came to her and said, Greetings, O favored one, the Lord is with you.
はい、もういきなりこの挨拶から、もうとてつもない、変なことなんですね、この時代にとっても。
Yeah, so this is kind of like a really strange, kind of weird greeting, especially for that time period.
はい、まず最初、いきなり入ってきました、天使が。
Yeah, so first, like the angel just suddenly appears in the first
日本
place.
だったらノックしますよね。
Yeah, so obviously, we're gonna have locks on our doors, especially in Japan.
そして入ってきた途端、おめでとう。何がおめでとうなんだと思いませんか？
And then he just shows up, and in English it says greetings, but in the Japanese, he literally just shows up and is like, congratulations. And it's just like, what?
何がおめでとうなの？
Like, why are you congratulating me? What did I do?
しかもまだ妊娠してない状態なのにおめでとうと言われて、しかも恵まれた方、あなたは祝福されてますよ、恵み与えられてますよっていうことを言われた瞬間に、マリアは天使が現れたことよりも天使が言ったことに驚いてるわけですよね。
Yeah, and she's probably kind of even more surprised at what the angel actually said, because the angel shows up and he's like, "Hey, congratulations, you are blessed. You have God's favor." And she's probably more like, "Okay, there's an angel, but what is he actually saying? I don't get it."
まず私たちが神の介入によって体験することは、それは私たちの固定概念、私たちが思っている人生観というものが覆されることです。
I think that from God kind of intervening in our lives, like the way that we think about things, kind of our preconceived notions about life and everything can be totally kind of overturned.
29節でマリアは何の挨拶かを考え込んだ、よく考えてるということですよね。
And as it says in like verse 29, it says she was greatly troubled and she like tried to discern what this was all about.
この後マリアは祝福どころか、ある意味悪い知らせのようなそのようなことを受け取ります。
And she kind of almost takes it as like not really as a blessing, but actually kind of as a bad thing.
私たちにとって大概の場合、神様を信じる、クリスチャンになる、また神様を受け入れるイコール、私たちの時に神様から何かご利益をもらえるような、そのようなものだって勘違いしています。
And I think a lot of times we often kind of think that an encounter with God means that God is going to just kind of show up almost like a genie and just give us blessing and just make our lives better.
ご利益という言葉自体も日本語の言葉ですけども、自分に利益があるかのような、そのような感じですよね。
You know, it's often like kind of this idea, especially in Japan, of like the goryaku, and it's very this like God is going to come in and just kind of bless you and give you things that benefit you.
すなわち神様は今ある私の人生に介入してくれて、そして良いものを付け加えてくれる。っていうそういう概念を信じてしまってます。
And we kind of often believe that it's just like this idea that God is there to just kind of make our lives better, and He's going to come in, and if He's going to do anything at all, it's going to just kind of bless us and make our lives.
神様は人生のおまけじゃないです。
And so but God is not just like a little kind of add-on bonus to our already great lives that makes it slightly better.
今ある人生にちょこっと何か良いものを祝福を加えてくれるようなそのような概念がキリスト教の概念ではないです。
Like the God of the Bible is not just like a God that kind of slowly comes in and kind of gives you some like life hacks to make your life slightly better.
むしろひっくり返すようなものです。
And He's actually a God that completely overturns everything.
神様が私の人生に入ってくるんではなくて、私たちが神様のストーリー、神様の人生、神様の計画に入っていくんです。
Because it's not God that comes into our lives, it's actually we who are then invited to be a part of God's grander story.
私たちはよく今までここ最近よく聞きますよね。神様を信じれば、仕事が見つかる、結婚ができる、人生幸せになる。いや、マリアは一見そのような幸せは、もらえませんでした。
Yeah, because often we kind of believe today that like we often hear like people saying like, oh, if you believe in God, then you'll find a good job or you'll be able to get married. But like that's not how Mary took this when God came into
そ
her
れ
life.
は良い知らせではないんです。
Like this was not good news for her.
良いものです。もちろん人生の。それは神様与えてくれるかもしれません。でも良い知らせ時代ではないんです。
You know, like it might be a good thing for her, but like kind of the news itself was not actually good for her.
でも神がもたらす最大の恵み、そしてグッドニュース、良い知らせというものは神様が一緒にいてくださる。神様の計画に介入、私たちが介入していける、それが良い知らせということです。
Yeah, but it ultimately is good news knowing that God is going to be with us, and this was kind of the ultimate thing that God was saying through this message.
もう一つのポイントは、私たち先ほど言いましたけども、神に出会うということは人生のある意味優先順位がひっくり返ることです。
And one of the other things that we want to point out is that when God comes into our lives and kind of turns everything upside down, that also means our order of priorities in life also gets turned upside down as well.
マリアはその当時でも当たり前の人生をこれから生きようとしている、そういう段階でした。
And Mary, in this time period, she was living a very normal life for the kind of person she was.
おそらく15歳、16歳、その近辺の年です。
And she was probably around, 15, 16 years
その
old.
時代では結婚するのが当たり前の時代、年齢。
And that was like in that time period, that was kind of like the normal age for young women to get married.
ヨセフと婚約、要は言い名付けとして、されてたんですが、ヨセフも、ダビデの家系ということで、 ダビデ、ハンサムでしたよね。だからまあその遺伝子をもらっていれば、まあイケメンと結婚できたかもしれません。
You know, and she was, she was betrothed to Joseph, who was in the line of Joseph, and who is, to Joseph, who was in the line of David, and David was kind of always seen as like this really good-looking guy. So she's like, maybe Joseph was a good-looking guy too, and she's like, okay, I'm betrothed to this good-looking guy. Like everything's going well for me.
まあ
Great.
ダビデの家系ということで王族の家系ですよ。だからまあ家柄としてもまあバッチリですよ。
Yeah, and also Joseph in the line of David, that's like the line of like a king, and so she's like, okay, I'm pretty set up pretty well here.
ねえね、ハッピーエバーアフターね、いつまでも幸せが続きました。そのようなストーリーが用意されてたような感じでした。
She's kind of the way that her circumstances are set up to be kind of this like happily ever after type story.
でもそれが覆されるわけです。
But this is completely overturned.
そして天使が言うにはあなたは聖霊によって身ごもりますと。
And the angel says to her, like, you're going to be conceived by the Holy Spirit.
まず考えてみてください。そんなことを周りの人に皆さんが言ったらどうなりますか。絶対あなたは不倫しただろう。で絶対他の男を見つけて妊娠したらそう思われますよね。
So think if, for example, like if she, she hears this and she's like, if she actually is going to tell other people, like this is why she's pregnant, people are going to be like, no, you probably just cheated on,
現にヨセフはその結婚約を破棄することを考えてたわけですよね。
like Joseph actually was thinking about divorcing her because like no one would have believed that she actually was pregnant from the Holy Spirit.
はい、まず偶像ナンバーワン覆されました。はい。承認欲求、周りからの評判が悪くなる。もう完全に破壊されました。
And, so from right here, like we can see that like her idol, like any kind of idol of approval that would have been there is completely kind of destroyed and overturned.
またリスペクトも失われてるわけなので、偶像、パワー、権力、その2つ目の偶像も破壊されています。
And then the second kind of idol that's destroyed is also like the idea of like wanting to get respect or power.
コントロールを失ってます。自分の人生が今まで確実だったものが覆されているわけです。
And then also like the idol of control is also destroyed too, and thinking like, oh, I don't know how my life's going to go. It's going to go like this. I have it all in order, but then that doesn't happen either.
心地よさもなくなってます。
And then also any comfort, the idol of comfort is also destroyed as well.
皆さんはどうでしょう。クリスチャンになることでそれらがチャレンジされてますか。
So for all of you guys here today in your own life, when you become a Christian, when you became a Christian, were those idols in your life challenged?
今まで思ってた方は思い通りにいかなくなっている状態。
Like the things that you thought like is it going to go? This is how I think it's going to go, but then did it not go that way? Like how did it work when you guys became?
今までみんなからリスペクトされ受け入れられてたのに、なんか自分が嫌いな人がどんどん増え始めた。
Like for example, like you were first being kind of respected by a lot of people, but then maybe later you started kind of being hated by a lot of people around you.
ある意味敵がどんどん多くなってきている。
Or maybe you just started making more and more enemies.
もしかしたらクリスチャンになる前の方が幸せを感じてたかもしれません。
Maybe even you felt like maybe I was even happier before I became a Christian.
良い知らせはこうです。もしあなたがそれを体験しているなら、それは良いことです。
And actually, the good news is that if you did experience it like that when you became a Christian, that is actually good news.
なぜなら神様は神以外の偶像、要は私たちが頼っているものを意図的に破壊する。神だけを崇めてほしい。そう思っている方だからです。
And it's because that God actually took you in that circumstance and actually destroyed those idols and made it so that God was the only good thing for you.
僕にとっても同じでした。
And that was actually the same for me as
僕はあ
well.
る意味クリスチャンになってもミニストリーをしている自分、牧師をやっている自分というものにある意味自分の安心安全または自分の将来すら希望を置いてました。
In the past, I was, a very like successful in ministry, and I was doing all these things, and I was putting my hope more in the fact that I was doing ministry than in God.
大きな教会を運営している自分、そしてメッセージをうまくやっている自分、そういうところに自分のアイデンティティや自分の安心安全、そして自信、承認すべて置いてました。
I was putting all of my identity and approval and all of my who I really was in how well I was running this big church and how well I was doing these messages every week.
その時、神様はそれを揺るがしました。要は牧師、ミニストリーをできるという立場を一旦僕から奪った時期がありました。それ10年前の話です。
But then this is one time 10 years ago where God actually took that away from me, and like this one thing that I was putting all of my identity on, this of being a good pastor, God took that away.
今まで計画した人生が一瞬で崩れ去りました。
And in an instant, the whole way that I was planning my entire life just completely fell apart.
ある意味神様に文句言いました。なんでもうレールが敷かれたような幸せやまた人生の満たしが待ってるはずなのになんで今更それを揺るがすの？そういう文句を言いました。
And I was really, I'm kind of like complaining to God, like really, like God, like I thought we got everything on track here. I thought we finally got things going, and now you're just completely derailing everything. I don't get it.
でもそれは神の計画の一部でした。それは私の心を神に向けさせるためでした。
But that actually was part of God's plan, to really make me face my own heart and to actually see what was going on in my heart.
皆さんは神様が意図的にそのような自分が今までしがみついていたもの、持っていた固定概念、アイディア、人生に対するアイディアをひっくり返したときに どのように反応してきましたか？
And so for all of us here today, like if we've experienced a similar thing where God completely just kind of destroys our preconceived notions about how life is supposed to go, how do we actually respond when that happens?
それは神からもっと離れる結果になっていますか、それとも神にもっと近づく結果になっていますか？
Do those things make us get farther and farther away from God, or do they help us draw near to God?
もっと教会に通って神様を崇めるきっかけになっていきます。それかまたは教会から離れる結果になっていますか？
Are they an opportunity for us to get more and more involved with God's community and God's church and to worship God even more, or do they cause us to get farther and farther away from God?
ティム・ケラー先生が一応このように言いました。もし祈りたくないって思ってるなら、その時こそ祈れって言ってます。
One of the things that Tim Keller said is like, if you ever feel like, oh, I just really don't want to pray, like that's when you should be praying.
教会行きたくないって思った時にこそ教会に行け。
Especially the time when you're feeling like, I really just don't want to go to church today. Like that's the day you should go to church.
賛美したくないって思ってる時に、むしろ賛美しろ。
When you're just not feeling it, like, I just don't really want to worship today, like that's when you should choose to worship.
なぜならもはや私たちの人生は自分の中心ではなく神中心だからです。
And it's because that our lives are not about us. They're supposed to be about God.
それが2つ目のポイントに入っていきます。
So with that, we want to go into the second point.
そのような神の介入があり、覆された時に、マリアはこのように言いました。34節、マリアは御使いに言った。どのようにしてそのようなことが起こるのでしょう。私は男の人を知りませんのにって言っています。
And so when these kinds of things that come into our life that completely overturn everything, when these things happen, we want to look at like what do people say in response to that. And especially for Mary in verse 34, this is how she responded. And she said, how will this be since I'm a virgin?
ちょっと出してもらえますか、聖書箇所をお願いします。34節ですね。はい。これ一見疑っているように聞こえます。
And from one look, this kind of might look like she's doubting that it's going to happen.
でも実は印象としてはどちらかというと疑いよりも好奇心なんです。
But actually, if you think about it more, it's not really doubting so much as it is like curiosity about like
実
how
は
specifically.
ルカという著者は意図的に人物を比較するようなスタイルをとって福音書をずっと書いています。
And the author of this passage, Luke, he's actually very intentional about comparing different characters.
例えばマリアとザカリア同じ章一章で比べています。
And he compares Mary specifically with Zechariah in the same chapter.
マリアとエリザベス比べています。
And he compares Mary and Elizabeth as well.
その後ずっと進んでいく、例えば法と息子、兄の方と弟を比較しています。
Or for example, like the parable of the prodigal son, he compares like the younger and the older brothers.
いろんな出来事もずっと比較していってるんです。
So he always has this kind of theme of like compare and contrast within the Gospel of Luke.
はい、そうするとザカリアのストーリーとですね、ザカリアですよね。はい、ザカリアのストーリーと比べるとちょっと面白いことが分かります。
And if we look at kind of comparing it to the story of Zechariah, there's kind of some interesting things in the story.
はい、じゃあルカ書の1章18節ちょっと出してもらう。これザカリアが言ったことです。
And so this is what Zechariah said in chapter 1 verse
はい、ザカリア
18.
が見つかりに行った。私はそのようなことを何によって知ることができるでしょうか。この私は年寄りですし、妻ももう年を取っています。って聞いてます。
Yeah, and so he said in the very similar situation that Mary was in, he said, "How shall I know this? For I am an old man and my wife is advanced in years."
同じ質問をしているように見えますけれども、全く違う性質です。
And it looks like he's asking the same thing, but it's actually very different.
マリアはこのように言ってるんです。それがどのように起こり得ましょうか。要は神様がそれをどう実現してくださるんでしょうかっていう興味、好奇心です
Mary is asking from this, she's really interested, she's curious, like how is God going to do this? I'm
ザ
just
カリアちょっと
curious.
出してもらっていいですか。ザカリアのままでお願いします。
And Mary's very curious, like how am I actually, or how is God actually going to do this thing that you've said?
でもザカリアは私です。私はどうやってそのことを知り得ましょうかって聞いてるんです。
But Zechariah is more self-centered, and he's just saying like, well, how am I going to understand the thing that you said?
自分中心です。
So it's very self-centered.
同じ疑問でも神中心なのか自分中心なのか大きな違いです。
So there's this big difference, and you're asking the same thing, but it's either God-centered or self-centered.
皆さんはどうでしょうか。
So how about for all of us?
教会に来たときに皮肉的にザカリアのように神様私はどうやって祝福されるって知るの、私がどうそれが分かる、要は皮肉的なそういう態度で教会に臨み賛美し、今このメッセージを聞いていますか。
So do we come into church kind of more like Zechariah, just more cynical and like, oh God, how are you going to bless me today? Like, oh yeah, I don't think I'm, how am I going to actually get anything out of the worship today?
それともメッセージを聞いている最中に神様は素晴らしい、神様はそういうことをしてくださるって言った時にワクワクしながら、でも神様はそれどうやってそれが実現するのって 思っていますか？
Or are we actually able to be more like Mary, where we're hearing these things in the message or at church, and we're actually like excited about it, but we're just like, God, how are you going to do that?
皮肉的に皆さん賛美の中で立ってって歌ってますか？
Do we just kind of stand there cynically during the worship and we're like, oh, okay, yeah, cool?
それとも心から神様は何が起こっているか分かりません。ある意味今通っている状況つらいです。でもあなたがしようとしていることをもっと知りたいです。それをどう実践されるのか教えてくださいって望みをかけていますか？
Or do we stand there more like Mary with hope and we're like, I don't know how this is going to happen, God, but I want to be expectant and hopeful, knowing that what you might do is just really amazing, and I just want to know more of what that is.
そのマリアの質問に天使は3つのことで答えてくれています。
And actually, in response to Mary's question, the angel answered with 3 things.
3つ私たちがクリスチャンとして生きる上で変えさせられるべきこと3つ最低限ここであると思ってください。
And so think of these 3 things as kind of like at the baseline of kind of the most important things that kind of change us in the Christian life.
はい、35節1つ目。
And these are, first one is in verse 35.
はい、御使いは彼女に答えた。聖霊があなたの上に臨み、糸高き方の力があなたを覆います。それゆえ生まれる子は聖なるもの、神と呼ばれますって書いてあります。
And the angel answered her, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child will be born and will be called Holy, the Son of God.
Is it saying overshadow?
Will overshadow
はい
you.
英語ではオーバーシャドウ、日本語では、聖霊が望んだ時に覆うっていう言葉が使われています。
Yeah, and the Japanese is kind of like God will like cover you, so it's like overshadowing you,
は
covering
い
you.
実はこの言葉は面白い言葉です。
And this word is actually a really interesting word.
この覆うっていう語源のニュアンスはですね、創世記のアダムとエバが形作られた時に神に似せて作られたそういう表現がありました。
And there's also this kind of similar expression back in Genesis where it talks about how Adam and Eve were made in the image of God.
神に似せられるっていう言葉、ヘブル語の言葉自体はですね、覆われるっていう言葉なんです。要は神の影に覆われる、オーバーシャドウ、そういう概念なんです。
And this kind of word where it says like made in the image of God, it's actually the same Hebrew word where it says like you're being overshadowed or covered by God.
要は神様のイメージで私たちは覆い隠される、覆われるっていう意味です。
And so it's this kind of this meaning of being covered completely by God and by God's image.
そしてこのギリシャ語のそのルカの一章の方の言葉も全く同じ概念です。ギリシャ語では、英語の訳は正しいんですけども、オーバーシャドウという言葉なんですね。
And this is the Hebrew word in Genesis, but then Luke also uses basically the same exact Greek word as well that kind of is like how it says in English, like this overshadowing.
ヨハネの16章では、聖霊が私たちのところにやってきたときに、聖霊の機能として、また聖霊の役割と一つとして、聖霊は私たちじゃなくて、イエス・キリストに栄光を与えます。っていう言い方をしています。Glorify him ね、Jesus ね。はい。
Yeah, and also in John 16:14, there's this part where like Jesus is talking about the Holy Spirit coming upon people, and when the Holy Spirit comes upon them, it actually says He will glorify me.
クリスチャンとしてのまず最初の生き方、または変化の一つとしては、もう私たち中心ではなく、私たち自分自身の使命や自分は誰とかそんなことにフォーカスをする人生ではなく、イエス・キリストという存在に目を向け始める。それがクリスチャンとしての第一歩なんです。
And so the first step really in the Christian life is this realization here that it's not about us. It's not like how is God going to make my life go this certain way? How is He going to give me this my destiny or these things? It's about how are we going to be a part of God's story.
だから天使はマリアにそれがどう起こるか分かりませんって言った時に、まず最初に重要なことはイエス・キリストに目を向けて。イエス・キリストが中心ですよ。イエス・キリスト、要はあなたが身ごもる子が全てのフォーカスですよ。っていう視点を変えさせてるんです。
And so that's why in response to Mary's question, the angel answers by saying, like, no, you need to put your hope in Jesus, into the son that is going to be born.
皆さん、マーベルの映画でドクター・ストレンジ覚えてますか？
So you guys remember the movie Doctor Strange, the Marvel movie?
僕がマーベルの中でも結構好きなあれなんですよ。ドクター・ストレンジの一つのテーマストーリーを一つのテーマで訳するとこういう感じです。
And maybe there's some Marvel fans here, but basically, if you could kind of say the main theme of that story of Doctor Strange, it would be this.
ドクター・ストレンジはね、有名な医者ですごく敏腕で能力もあるんだけども、その能力すべて失います。
And so, he starts off, he's like this really, really skilled, famous doctor, but he loses all of that ability.
そしてある偉大な師匠にいろんな新しいスキルを学ぶんですけども。
And then he eventually has this encounter with this master, and he learns all these new crazy
そしてで
skills.
もドクター・ストレンジまだ自分という存在を捨てきれないんですね。
But he still can't get over this idea of like himself. He's still thinking about how is this going to help me.
そして師匠が彼のために自分の命を投げして死ぬ瞬間に師匠が彼にこのように言うんです。
And there's this moment where the master actually, right before the master dies, and then she tells him this.
一言、It's not about you.
She tells him, It's not about you.
もうあなたが中心じゃないんだよ。
You're not the center of this.
これからあなたは偉大な、ソーサラー、そういう存在になっていくんですけども、でもあなたは中心じゃないんだよ。
And like, he goes on from them to becoming this great, powerful sorcerer or whatever, but he realizes in that moment that he's doing that not for himself.
神が介入したときにもはやもう自分の人生、自分のストーリー、自分の計画、自分の理想じゃないんです。
He's realizing that like, having it being all about himself is not what God's ideal is. That's not what God is planning.
ザカリアの問題は私がどうそれを知り得ましょう。自分中心です。
Because the problem with Zechariah was that he was just so self-centered about it. He's like, well, how am I going to know? How is this going to help me?
でもマリアの応答に対して天使はそれゆえって言ってますね。だからあなたは糸高き子イエスを見ましょう。イエスが中心ですよって言ってるわけです。
Yeah, but that's why the angel says to Mary in response to her question of like, that's why the power of the Most High will overshadow you because it's about Him.
僕が面白いなと思ったのはマリアは男の人を知らないのにって面白い言い方ですよね。別に要は別の言い方すると、自然な性的関係を持ってないのにどうして私が身ごもるんですかっていうことを聞いてるんですけども。
And because in Mary's question she actually says like since I'm a virgin, she actually kind of says like in the Japanese more like, oh, I haven't known a man, I haven't done any of the normal things that you do to become pregnant.
いやこういうことが言えるかもしれません。もう人がどうのこうのじゃないんです。人間がどうするか要は男の人を知るか知らないか人間ができることの範囲を超えて神がすることだっていうところに天使は目を向けているわけです。
I think what the angel is also doing in his response is saying like, hey, this isn't about man or what man can do or not do. This is about God and what God can do.
もう私たちの小さな人生のボックスを超えて神のでっかい計画に入っていく。それがクリスチャンの醍醐味、人生の醍醐味です。
And so what the angel is really pointing out to Mary is what he's pointing out to all of us too, is that it's helping us break out of the mold and just thinking about it all our own lives and helping us really becoming a part of God's story.
36節2番目の要素。
And then the second element that he shares with her is in verse 36.
はい、皆さんあなたの親類のエリザベス、あの人もあの年になって男の子を宿しています。
It says, and behold, your relative Elizabeth in her old age has also conceived a son.
はい、私たちの人生中心じゃなくなった時にまず2つ目に神様がしてくださる要素っていうものは私たち以外の人生に目を向けさせてくれるっていうことだと思います。
So one of the other things that God does when He helps us realize that it's not all about us, it's all about Him, is that He also helps us realize that it's about other people around us as well.
要は自分が体験している同じ神様の体験を似たような境遇にいる人たちとシェアできるようにさせてくれる要素かもしれません。
And it might be kind of being able to share and relate with those who are in very similar circumstances that we are in their experience with God.
喜びも苦しみもまた疑問も葛藤も。
And that might be sharing different joys or struggles that you have with each other.
それはもちろん私たちにとっては教会コミュニティまたはコミュニティグループそういう存在になっていくと思います。
And I think that specifically today really takes the shape of like our Christian community, like at church or community.
先ほど言いました教会そういうような人生が許さがらされた時にもっと教会という人間関係に入っていきますかまたは教会という人間関係から離れていますかめちゃくちゃ重要な要素なんです。
I think this is a very important thing. It's just kind of like the question that we asked at the beginning of church, like when God comes into your life and overturns everything, does that cause you to get farther and farther away from other people and from God or to draw closer to them?
もしそのような決断をしているのはそれは間違った決断だと思います。
Because if we make that decision of like, oh, I'm just going to get farther away from people, I think that's actually the wrong decision in that moment.
なぜなら自分から目を離す最初のステップそれは他の人々にも目を向けることだからです。
Because actually, when we're having that first step of like taking our eyes off of just ourselves, I think that it's very natural to then start looking at other people and those around us as well.
僕が、CDT3 というねそういう世界に関わり始めた時にまだ教会始めたばっかりでした。この教会始めたばっかりの時でした。
And so the time when I actually started getting more connected with city to city and the church network that we're a part of, that's when I kind of just started with this church.
僕はシリシリの団体を通してトレーニングを受けて、先ほど言いました牧師という立場を一旦失って、そして神様に委ねていたそういう時期でした。要は神様、あなたの御心なら僕はもう一度牧会しますし、そうでないなら別に牧会しなくてもいいですって言えた状況でした。
And this was at the time in my life when I had just kind of, in the previous story that I was sharing, had just lost my position as a pastor and was like, I'm not sure what to do going forward here. But I started receiving this training from city to city, and I was thinking like, okay, God, like, do you want me to become a pastor or not? Like, I'm willing to be one way or the other. I want to give.
それは自分で何とかしようとする状況ではなくて、神に任せることができた状況でした。
This is when I was in a situation where I was ultimately able to kind of relinquish that up to God and to trust in Him either way.
その中のプロセスで、実はあるミーティング、シティシティのミーティングにニューヨークに行ったことがあったんですね。
And there was a city-to-city meeting that we then had for the training, and we went to New York, and there was a meeting there.
そしてそこにサイモン・マーフィー、要は先週のゲストスピーカーがそこにいました。同じミーティングにいました。
And that's where Simon Murphy, the guy who preached last week, if you remember, he was there at this meeting as well.
そしてもう一人マーク・タッピングという、先生がオーストラリアのパースから来ている先生がいました。
And there was this other teacher named Mark Tapping from Perth in Australia.
彼らを見たときに僕はなんか似たものを感じるなと思ったんですね。
And we were all there and we met, and we kind of had this sense of like, I just feel like we all kind of get each other for some
で、向
reason.
こうも僕を見た瞬間にいきなりなんかにこやかに話しかけてきて、なんかで後で聞いてみたら同じものを感じたらしいです。
You know, and they also kind of, when they looked at me, they kind of came up, they just like, oh, wow, this guy seems cool. And they came up and they just talked to him very friendly. And when they talked later, they actually kind of realized they were all thinking very like similar things. Like we all
も
kind
ち
of
ろ
get
ん
each other.
もっと話してみたらお互いに同じクリスチャンの背景、例えばペンテコステカリスマ派の背景で育ってでも今は別の形で福音中心性を目指してその旅を今生きようとしている、そういう状況に置かれていた3人でした。
And the three of us, we all kind of realized that through talking a lot more later that we had all very similar experiences of growing up more in a Pentecostal church and then kind of getting a little bit kicked out of that and then realizing like, oh, I want to do something and I want it to be more gospel-centered. And we had this thing that in common that we could relate about.
皆さんはどのように自分の人生を他の人と共有していますか？
So for all of us today, in a similar way, like what are the areas of your life that you're able to share with other people?
正直に
Like really honestly.
どうやって痛みを、その辛い状況をマリアとエリザベスが一緒にやっていったように祈り合いながら神を賛美しながら生きていますか？
Like what are the ways like how Elizabeth and Mary kind of shared their pain with each other? Like what are the ways that we're able to do that in our own lives?
3番目の要素。
And then the third element that the angel
37
taught
節。
in verse 37.
神にとって不可能なことは何もありません。
For nothing will be impossible with God.
世の中は私ができるですよね。
And the way that the world works is, it's I can.
自分を信じれば私は何でもできる。何でもなれる。そういう概念です。
If you believe in yourself, if you set your mind to it, you can do it.
クリスチャンは全く違います。
It's complete opposite for
クリスチャン
Christians.
こうです。私はできない。
Yeah, Christians is more like I can't do it.
自分の人生もコントロールできない。
I can't control my own life.
今まで計画していたものもすでに脱線して、脱線完全にはしてないですけども、評判もなくし、心地よさもなくし、自分には何もできないけども、でも神様にできる。
If I try to control my life, if I try to make it go a certain way, it's just not going to go that way. Or even if it does, I'm going to lose my comfort or my control over that thing. But so I can't do these things, but God can.
クリスチャンこそまさしく現実主義と同時に理想主義、その両方になれるんです。
And Christianity is actually really, truly at the same time being realistic about life, but also idealistic at the same time.
ここで面白いですね。マリアはただ天使が現れてそれを言ったことをはい信じますと言ったわけじゃないです。マリアは悩みながら考え込んでるっていう言葉が結構これからまた使われていくんですけども、結構考えてます。思い巡らしてるわけですよ。
Mary didn't just like when the angel came and told her this, she wasn't just like, all right, got it, I believe. Like she was very, like it says she was greatly troubled and she tried to discern like what's going on.
そうですよね。だからクリスチャンになるってことは考えないことではないです。
So for being a Christian, that doesn't just mean like blindly taking everything, be like, okay, yeah, cool, and like not thinking about it.
ある意味意図的に考え、そしてある意味健康的な疑問を持って考え抜くことです。
It's actually the reverse. It's actually like being very intentional to think about these things and even having like healthy doubts about them.
自分の弱さを知り、自分の状況、自分がどういう本当に存在なのか、無力な存在なのかをまず自覚することです。
And it really starts with like being more kind of self-aware about your own weaknesses and like the situation that you're in.
でも同時に楽観主義になれるんです。理想主義です。なぜなら神がいるから。神ならできるからです。
But if it's only that, it's going to become really just kind of depressing. So at the same time, it's having this optimism and knowing that God can and God will do this.
僕はどちらかというと楽観主義です。
For me, I kind of tend to lean towards more the optimistic side.
僕は何でもいい方向に捉えてしまいます。
I always just kind of like, yeah, things are going to go well, things are going to be great.
教会はなんとかなるよって。
Yeah, it's church, like it'll be good. Church is great.
なんて大丈夫。
Yeah, it'll be fine.
Don't worry, be happy. そんな感じですよ。
Yeah, it'll be fine. Just don't worry about it.
いつも頭の中が悪なまたたれ、音楽がかかってる感じです。
I always kind of have this little, kind of music. I'm like, it's going to be great. Yeah.
悪なまたた重視の。
Hakuna Matata? Some happy song.
Some happy song. でもうちの妻は真逆です。
Yeah, but then a lot of times it's, the exact opposite.
結構悲観主義的で、ペシミスティックな感じなんですね。
Yeah, so my wife is a lot more kind of like pessimistic and kind of just like, things are not going to go well.
でもそれこそバランスですよね。僕は常に、楽観主義でなかなか問題を見ようとしない。でもうちの妻は常に問題を見てます。
But for me, I'm always just like, things are going to be fine. Like, don't worry about it. But my wife is very more like pessimistic, like worried, like, oh, this is going to go bad. This is really going to go badly. And so it's kind of a good balance where she helps me to actually see real problems because she focuses on.
できるんですよ。
But a true Christian is able to do both of these.
問題に目を向けられる。なぜですか？怖くないからです。神様が何とかしてくれるから問題を直視できるんですよ。
Because if there's a problem, like we can actually look at it, but we can see like, well, ultimately, even if this looks really bad, ultimately it is going to be okay because God is here.
でも問題が解決されてなくても別にそこまでフルストレーションたまらなくていいんですよ。
And so even if that problem is not resolved, it's okay to not be frustrated about it because we know that God is still in control.
皆さんはどうでしょうか？教会やまた自分の人生を見たときに教会の悪いとこばっかり目がいきますか
？For all of us, like kind of which side do we tend to? Do we kind of look at the church and we're just like, oh, this problem, all these things are not going well?
また僕みたいにいや別に問題ないじゃんと思ってます。
Are we more like me where it's just like, yeah, it's fine, it's church, like whatever, it's going to be great?
ある意味問題を見ることを怖がっていますか
？Or do we really just like are afraid to even look at problems?
客観的にポジティブに問題を指摘できますか
？Are we able to really kind of positively, we kind of like hope for the future, point out problems in the church?
そのテンションに生きていますか
？Are we living in that tension?
3番目のポイント。じゃあどうすれば私たちはマリアのように応答することができるんでしょうか
？And so that's what brings us to the third point, which is how can we learn to respond in the way that Mary did?
38節
Verse 38.
マリアが言った。ご覧ください。私は主のはしためです。どうぞあなたのお言葉通りに好みになりますように。すると御使いは彼女から去っていった。
It says, and Mary said, Behold, I am a servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word. And the angel departed from her.
はい、もうクリスチャンの教科書のような答え方ですよね。
This is like the perfect textbook Christian, like correct answer to say.
謙遜的に主よ、私はあなたのはしため奴隷です。どうかあなたの御心がなりますように。
She's just like, I am a servant of the Lord. Let it be done according to your will, God. Like, it's a perfect answer.
こう思ってるかもしれません。
But then you might be thinking like this, maybe.
マリアは天使まず出てきたよね。
You'd be like, well, yeah, Mary saw a literal angel. Of course she would answer that way.
ずるいじゃんって。いきなり神様の言葉、天使から直接もらってるしって。
Well, yeah, of course. She has like literally God's exact word, like literally from an angel. Like, how could she not believe?
それだけじゃなくて、奇跡的に妊娠してるとてつもないサインじゃん。
Yeah, and then she literally had this like miracle of being conceived. Like, obviously, this is like a clear sign. Of course, it's easy to believe,
そこま
right?
で経験したら絶対マリアのようにこんな答え方できるよって思ってませんか？
Don't you think like, well, yeah, if I experienced that literal exact thing, of course I would believe, duh.
正直に言います。できません。
Yeah, but I don't think like if I don't think we can actually believe that.
僕だったらもうパニックってると思います。婚約が破棄される私の白馬の王子様が奪い去られるってもう超心配を襲われてると思います。
Yeah, I don't think like we'd actually be able to, if we really experience that, I don't think we'd actually be able to like have the same response that Mary did just because we experienced it. We'd probably be like, oh crap, like my like engagement's gonna be all messed up now. People are gonna think I cheated on him. Like you're just gonna start worrying about all these different things.
絶対こんな反応できませんよ。
I don't think we're actually, just because we physically experience it, are going to be able to actually respond in the way that she did.
じゃあなぜマリアはできたんでしょうか？
So then why did she actually respond in that way? What helped
私
her
た
to
ち
do
は
that?
どう同じようにザカリアではなくマリアのように応答できるんでしょうか？
And what is that thing that helps us to be able to respond in that same way as well, not like Zechariah?
この話の中心、この一章全体の話の中心はマリアじゃないです。
And the whole centerpiece of this story that we're looking at is not Mary.
男の子、要は神の子、男の子っていうテーマがずっと流れてるんです。
There's this theme of this child of God, the son of God that is going throughout the whole story.
これはジョンのメッセージにも後ほどありますけれども、要は男の子が生まれるっていうのがテーマなんです。
You know, and Jonah will have a message later, but it's this theme of a son will be born, a child will be born.
それはアブラハムとサラのストーリーも影響してますし、そして中心はその生まれる子なんです。
You know, this will also kind of talk about like Abraham and Sarah's story as well, but like the centerpiece is that a son will be born, a son will be given to us.
そしてその意味は何ですか？神が共におられる。
And what does that mean? That means that God will be with us.
そうですよね。私たちは実はマリア以上に信じられる要素、神から与えられているんです。
And the reality is that we actually have kind of more grounds and more reason to believe this than Mary does.
もちろんマリアは実際にイエス・キリストを身ごもみ自分の中に育て、イエス・キリストが成長していっていく様を経験しました。
Of course, Mary like literally physically experienced Jesus growing inside of her.
でも私たちは霊的にイエス・キリストっていう存在をクリスチャンになることで迎え入れ、霊的にイエス・キリストが自分のエゴ、自分の自己中心さを解決し、イエス・キリストという存在がどんどん自分の中ででかくなっていくっていうチャンスを与えられているわけですよね。
But for us as Christians, like we actually have this chance to have Jesus like spiritually be growing inside of us to grow bigger and bigger and to change us and to take away our ego and to make our lives more about Him.
でもそのきっかけはある意味戸惑いをもたらします。
But this kind of thing actually happening, like actually really does kind of troubles us at times.
イエス・キリストは天から私たちのもとに生まれやってきて、そして私たちの人生に介入してくださいました。
And it's because like Jesus, you know, He came all the way from heaven down into our lives and He intervened and He was born into our world.
でも十字架にかかりました。
But then He was also hung on the cross.
私たちの罪のために十字架にかかった。それを私たちが聞いたときにまず戸惑います。困惑します。なんでって。
You know, when we actually hear like the Jesus he came down from heaven to be born into our world, all to be hung on a cross for our sins. We're like, wait, what? Like, why is He doing this for all?
意味
For
が
us?
最初わかりません。
Like, we're going to be troubled. We're going to be like, I don't understand. Why is this
どん
happening?
な神なんだ。
You know, what kind of God is this that He would do
ど
all
ん
of
な
this for us?
介入の仕方なんだ。
You know, what kind of intervention is God doing here?
なぜ神が私たちの罪のために死ぬ必要があったんだ。
You know, why is it necessary for God to die for us?
そこを考え込まなくちゃいけないわけです。
You know, and that's something like we actually, you know, have to think about really hard.
十字架を通して私たちは自分の現実に向き合わされます。
Because when we look at the cross, it really makes us face our own reality.
自分の偶像が試されます。今まで頼ってたものが覆されます。
You know, it challenges our idols. It really, anything that we were relying on to before, it kind of gets destroyed and
自
shaken
分は
down.
良い人間だと思ってたのがそうでないと分かります。
You know, we thought we were a good person, but then we look at it and we're like, actually, realize that we're not.
自分いい人生を送っていた。将来は確実、安心安全だと思ってたのが、いや、このままじゃ人生最悪、地獄に行くって分かります。
You know, we realized like we thought our lives were going well, we thought everything was going to be okay, but we realized that actually if it's going to keep going the way that it is, it's going to end up in hell and everything will not go well.
ショックですよ。
Like this is a huge shock.
でもそれが神のストーリーに入っていくきっかけになっているわけですよ。
But at the same time, like this is an opportunity to become a part of God's story.
でもそこで終わってはません。
But this is not just where it ends.
それだけやったら悲観主義です。
Because if it ends just like that, it's just really pessimistic.
イエス・キリストは死から復活した。
Because Jesus also rose from the dead.
要は不可能を可能にしてくださった神を信じることができるわけです。
Because that's when we can truly believe in the God who can do the impossible.
要は完全な理想主義、楽観主義になれるわけです。
And so that's when we can truly then have a completed kind of optimistic look at life as well.
十字架こそめちゃくちゃネガティブ、そしてめちゃくちゃポジティブな希望ある象徴です。
Because the cross is the symbol of kind of being ultimately, it's very ultimately pessimistic and optimistic at the same time.
十字架こそその神の子イエス・キリストに目を向けさせてくれる象徴です。
Because it's the thing that really helps us to look at the Son of God.
十字架こそこのマリアのストーリーの完成です。
Because it is the ultimate completion of this story, of the story of Mary.
皆さんどうでしょう。
So how about for all of us here today?
マリアのように今通っていることを超えて応答したいと思いませんか。
So do you guys feel, even just going through what you're going through right now, that you want to be able to respond in the way that Mary did here?
仕事をなくした人もいるかもしれません。
There might be people who have lost their job recently.
周りの人間関係に幻滅している状態かもしれません。
There might be people who are just kind of disillusioned by the relationships around them.
教会につまずいているかもしれません。
Might be people who are just struggling in church.
自分のパートナーにつまずきを覚えているかもしれま
Might
せん。
be people who are just struggling in their marriage.
でも神がそれを許されているならまず自分の罪を解決しましょう。
But first, if we're realizing that it's something that God is permitting, like let's just have this as an opportunity to deal with our own sin that we're faced
そ
to
して
see in that
もう
moment.
一度 この福音という良い知らせを通して悔い改め、そして神に頼りましょう。
And through this good news that we're now seeing through this gospel, let us help it to just have that lead us to repentance.